flush of the moon was in her noble face, the lifting of pride in her smooth brow, the ray of love-making in both her royal eyes, a dimple of sport in both her cheeks. She was the fairest and loveliest and most perfect of the women of the world that the eyes of men had ever seen. They thought she must be of the fairies. Austrian market town of Hallstatt, which hugs the shores of an alpine lake, towers the Salzburg, literally Salt Mountain. From it, men have been taking salt since long before recorded time. Probably the mountain's treasure was first discovered by primitive hunters tracking their game to saline springs, where crystals collecting on the rocks provided a necklaces of Scandinavian amber, and sword hilts inlaid with imported gold and ivory pointed to an affluence based on trade of considerable dimensions. Even more fascinating, many of the weapons, swords, daggers, spearheads, battle axes, were made of a material new to graves of the region, iron. Taking their first look at the graves in the Hallstatt cemetery, scholars thought that the iron objects, like the other artifacts, were imports. Later, they decided that the design and craftsmanship were unique and probably indigenous. Certainly, iron ore was available from the mines nearby in the Eastern Alps, which were widely known in the ancient world, but the route by which iron technology reached the region must have been long and circuitous. In the Middle East, metalsmiths had known about iron for centuries. The Hittites were producing and marketing iron objects as far back as 1500 BC, but from the end of the Hittite Empire in 1200 BC to the first known appearance of iron in Central Europe about 700 BC lies a period in the history of iron technology about which archaeologists can only guess. Though numerous iron objects have been found in Middle Eastern sites that can be dated from this puzzling 500-year void, clues to the development and spread of the ironworking art from the Middle East are virtually non-existent. Yet, however, the skill arrived in Central Europe. It must have been well received. From previous experience with copper and bronze, and with a natural aptitude for technological pursuits, the metalworking peoples north of the Alps quickly became competent iron workers. They learned how to mine the ore, how to crush and combine it with layers of charcoal, and how to heat the ore until it became a blackened sponge or bloom. They learned how to hammer the bloom to remove the cinders or slag, a process that rarely and only inadvertently resulted in a carburizing of the metal to produce a kind of rudimentary steel. They learned how to forge the hot iron into a variety of shapes by repeatedly heating it and hammering it while it was malleable. These first European blacksmiths were not only apt students, they were also particularly fortunate in having an abundance of raw material right in the immediate vicinity. In some areas, iron was abundant, not only in rich veins, but in bogs, marshy depressions in the earth's surface, where smiths could simply dredge it up. In fact, the metal was so easy to come by that it soon generated a flourishing industry, and iron weapons became as popular as those made of bronze. So let's just take a look at this illustration. This is a painting by Austrian artist Isidor Engel, and it is Lake Hallstatt. It lies surrounded by mountains near Salzburg. During the mid-19th century, a vast cemetery was discovered with the graves of some of the earliest Celts. Wherever it has appeared throughout history, iron has changed the way of men. It has given them new tools to build with, new weapons to cut each other down with. Iron is expansionist. It rolls over hills and farmers and herdsmen, pushed from their hereditary lands, probably by an expanding population, combined with a need for fresh soil to cultivate. They moved in among other peoples, taking with them such technological improvements as a heavy plough with an iron share, which the Celts eventually introduced to the rest of Europe. This implement was far more efficient than the existing wooden plough share, which could only score the ground. With the iron ploughshare, it was possible to break up the soil and to put even heavy clay soils under cultivation. Furthermore, it helped farmers to turn under topsoil depleted by past crops and bring to the surface rich soil to nourish future crops. The Celts also brought with them advanced ideas in carpentry, which they could apply to boat building, deftly wielding adzes to fashion masts, oars, and the planks that made up the hulls of seaworthy vessels. But most of their woodworking skill went into the construction of elaborate fortifications to protect their settlements from the constant raiding that was a feature of Celtic life. The earliest versions of these fortifications, called hill forts, were placed on high ground for obvious reasons, and usually they operated more like army garrisons than ordinary towns. Though the nobility sometimes lived in them, along with such respected craftsmen as smiths, the hill forts were primarily places of temporary refuge. Farmers and herdsmen crowded into them, along with their families and their animals, when their lands were under attack from marauding Celtic tribesmen. The walls of the hill forts were massive earthwork affairs braced internally with timber supports. A ditch surrounded the outside wall, and inside, the few dwellings were sometimes built directly against the wall, lending it extra support. Archaeologists studying the construction of one such hill fort near Abernethy, Scotland, estimated that its carpenters had used 3,200 linear feet of 9-inch wide lumber for the internal support of a wall that enclosed about an eighth of an acre. To do so, they had to fell some 640 trees of suitable size, a logging operation that must have covered some 60 acres of forest. By the 6th century BC, these assertive, technological, precocious Celts had come to dominate most of France and the Low Countries, and they had pushed over the Pyrenees to establish Celtic enclaves in Spain. By the 4th century BC, they had crossed the English Channel to intrude themselves on the indigenous peoples living along the lower reaches of the Thames. But the centre of their power eventually established itself in an area roughly composed of what is now Switzerland, Western Austria, southern Germany and France. In this heartland, especially in the lush valleys of the Seine, Rhone use as flares for light. His cargo will be salt. The mine's intense cold necessitates warm clothing, woolen shirt and breeches, leather footgear and a sheepskin cap. And on this side, two Celtic miners work in tandem, one holding a pickaxe and the other wielding a wooden mallet to chip a heart-shaped outline into a wall of salt. Next, they will score the heart down the middle and pry both sections from the wall. Using this highly efficient two-man approach, the work was so steady that the men, warmed by their exertion, could doff some of their heavy clothes. The curve of the pickaxe handle has a special purpose. It dissipates the force of the mallet blows, helping the pickman to hold the axe steady. Even so, the impact of the hammer blows and the brittleness of the rock-hard salt shattered many an axe. Broken axe points still litter many mines. So here we have early artifacts of intricate design. Here on the right hand side is a bronze cart. It's actually only 10 inches high and fashioned by a Hallstatt artisan. Maybe a miniature of the type used in rituals. The ducks adorning it properly had a mystical meaning, since for the Celts many birds were symbols of divinity. And in this picture we see a 4-inch wide bronze brooch from Hallstatt grave in Austria, with its row of triangle and chain pendants, was obviously designed to delight the Celtic wearer's ear as well as his eye. And here, boldly decorated with incised and impressed